What's this? 2 Yokomo reviews in a row? Well, yeah. I had planned to switch brands to Yokomo for my 2-wheel drive buggy and 4-wheel drive buggy for a while after having to shift 20 plus screws on my Losi to get to the differential on my 22. I wanted something easier to work on, but also something new that I could do a video on. Like before, I had heard that Yokomo were basically a copy of Associated and vice versa all the time, but I wanted to see if that was true. Before we begin, however, I'd like to remind you to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you like my content. Without further delay, this is my experience with the Yokomo YZ-2 CAL3. Now if you watched my other review of this car's 4-wheel drive sibling, you'll know I was a bit overwhelmed but overall impressed with the fluidity of the build itself. There was no going from one bag later on back to another earlier one, no real excess of parts in the bags, and everything was molded together very well as if they really cared about what they were designing. This 2-wheel drive on the other hand unfortunately didn't go together as smoothly as the 4-wheel drive did for me. This is mostly due to the fact that this was the first 2-wheel drive I had built from Yokomo, but also because that thing about there not being any hangover from bag to bag, yeah, that's gone in this kit. There's a decent amount of having to set aside parts for later steps in the build, but luckily there's no having to tear open later bags for earlier steps. It's not completely linear, but it does have a purpose. For example, one of the things I liked about my Losi was the fact that the last thing you do in it is put in the electronics. This Yokomo does much of the same, but at the expense of having to set aside parts early on in the build for later. Specifically the servo mount and ESC tray, which is made out of plastic unfortunately. One really good thing about this kit though is the fact that it comes with a steel pivot block instead of a plastic or aluminum one. This is quite good not just for performance on high grip surfaces like AstroTurf or carpet, but also for strength. Plastic pivot blocks always seem to break on hard crashes. As for the instructions themselves, they're good enough to get across what you need to do, but they are a bit cluttered as both Japanese and English are used in the instructions. Like I mentioned in my previous video about the YZ-4, I like the fact that the turnbuckle and suspension link illustrations are 1-to-1 in terms of size and length, making it much easier to build and set up right out of the box. Of course, I did finally invest in a micrometer, but it's still nice to see. Overall, the build was pretty good and relatively easy to pull off in half a day, not including the electronics. I just wish it was a bit more linear like its 4-wheel drive sibling. Sounds weird, but I actually think that build was both easier and more enjoyable for me. Something I did not expect to think, and I'm not gonna lie. Okay, driving time. When I started to drive the YZ-2, it felt very familiar to most other 2-wheel drive buggies I've been able to drive, specifically the B6.3. I mean, look how similar they look to each other. We'll get to that later. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to get footage of this thing driving for the first time as I wasn't being diligent and forgot to bring my camera to practice. So this footage you're seeing now is after a decent amount of practice and a better understanding of the new layout. With that being said, you'll have to take me at my word that it really did not take me long to start setting hot laps with this thing. This buggy somehow rides the fine line between being extremely easy to drive and somehow really fast at the same time. No, this particular buggy does not have ceramic bearings, nor does it have any aftermarket parts like titanium turnbuckles or a slipper eliminator. In fact, the only modification I had to do to this thing was a 16 gram battery weight in order to meet the new minimum weight requirements. It's not 1500 grams anymore, by the way. It's 1474 now. All the footage you're seeing of this thing is completely box stock. Now, I haven't been able to test this thing on any other surface other than AstroTurf as there hasn't been a big race at Columbus since that Snap Hard race to warrant the 2-hour drive there, so I can't be certain how it handles. I'm willing to bet though that this buggy handles quite well as Yokomo has won and placed well at the big leagues like the IFMAR Worlds and such in 2-wheel drive. Maybe not winning too often, but always ending up in the finals, without fail. Also, one of the people I know who runs Yokomo usually does pretty well at Columbus, so I'm willing to take his word. One of the number one things I'd see a lot of people talk about when it comes to the Yokomo brand as a whole, it's their similarity to Team Associated. I am aware that the two companies have a history when it comes to racing though. To make a very long story short, Team Associated had a gentleman's agreement with Yokomo that went something like this. Yokomo's drivers would run Team Associated 2-wheel drives, while Associated drivers would run Yokomo 4-wheel drives. I highly recommend looking more into the story of these two. I'll link off some more videos that go more into depth of their history and RC racing history as a whole in the description. It's very interesting. Anyway, the two companies have a history, and as a result, so a lot of their designs throughout the history have been quite similar for the most part, and that's no different here. On a surface level, these buggies can look almost identical. but when you start to look a little bit closer and concentrate, you start to notice the differences. The Yokomo is a bit shorter. Its pivot block is a little bit larger to add extra weight to the front. The front shocks are laid down more. The servo appears to be further forward. The battery mount is easier to pop out, but also easier to adjust. And the fan mount is mounted behind the motors, not to the side. These differences are minuscule, but they do make slight differences in performance, and personally, I think they help a little bit. This is one of those things that can only be assessed with time, but for the time being, this has been quite durable. Nothing is broken quite yet. I've heard from forums and other Yokomo groups though that the arms on these things tend to be a little bit weaker than other brands for some reason, and that a solution to this is to boil the arms to make them softer and more durable. I'm probably not going to do this, at least for a while, as I want to get an idea of how the buggy runs as intended from the factory. Speaking of working as intended, I'm not 100% sure these battery straps are. They are very flexible plastic, which is good for strength, but not so good for actually keeping the battery in place. Far too often in a crash would the strap come undone and cause your battery to come out. If there's one upgrade I'm going to do this buggy over time other than ceramic bearings, it would be a different battery strap system. Probably this one from Clinic RC. All in all, I'll have to take more time to figure out how durable this thing really is. Everything considered, this is a very good buggy. Definitely something I can hold on to for a while. As for whether or not I'd recommend it to a beginner, if you happen to live near a track or hobby shop that supplies Yokomo parts, then yes, I would recommend it, as it is very easy to work on. If you don't live near to one, then I'm not 100% sure I would. This is a good buggy, end of story. It doesn't do enough to separate itself from its competition, but that's because it doesn't really have to. That's all for now. If you like my videos, feel free to like the video, comment what you thought of it, and subscribe for more. Also, if you want to get up-to-date info on my videos, then when they come out, feel free to subscribe to my Patreon. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my patrons Michael Williams, Lucas Targa, RC World Discord server, and Casey Nix. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.